The first time I noticed her watching my lawn, I told myself it was nothing, just another neighbor doing that slow suburban scan where people pretend they're admiring flower beds when they're really counting what doesn't match the neighborhood's idea of perfect. But then it happened again the next day and the day after, and the pattern began to feel less like coincidence and more like a routine, like she had made my front yard part of her morning schedule. Our neighborhood was the kind built to look peaceful from above, tidy roofs, identical sidewalks, the illusion of calm. Yet beneath it was a culture where small controls were treated like a moral code, and the HOA existed not as a support system, but as a constant set of eyes. I wasn't new to that world. I had already learned to keep receipts, to file paperwork, to document repairs the way other people document family photos. Because in a place like this, being normal wasn't enough. You had to be provably normal. Still, I believed lawn rules were the lowest rung of HOA drama, the kind of petty nonsense that stayed annoying but harmless, so when the first notice arrived, I didn't panic. It was a clean white sheet with the HOA logo at the top, a citation for excessive grass height, and it listed a measurement as if someone had taken a scientific reading, 1 inch over allowable height. The number was so specific it was almost funny, and for a moment I assumed it was automated, one of those mass warnings they send to justify their existence. But the language was too personal for that, the tone sharp in a way that implied a human was behind it, someone who wanted me to feel watched. I trimmed the lawn the same day, not because I feared the rule, but because I didn't want friction, and I thought that would end it the way these things usually ended. Small compliance, small satisfaction, and everyone moved on. Instead, 2 days later, another notice arrived, again citing grass height, again listing a measurement, this time claiming I had missed the boundary strip along the sidewalk, the very edge that most people never notice unless they're looking for something to punish. I walked outside and checked the lawn like it was a crime scene, and it was clean, even no uneven patches, no wild corner, nothing that justified the warning, and that was when the irritation turned into something sharper, because it wasn't about the grass. It was about someone wanting to win. Then I saw her for real, not just as a silhouette passing by, but as a presence, standing at the edge of my property with a clipboard tucked against her chest like it was a badge of office. Her posture rigid and proud, the kind of confidence that comes from believing you are on the side of rules. She wasn't holding a phone or taking casual photos like most busybodies. She had a tool in her hand, something long and straight that caught the sunlight. And as I watched, she bent down and pressed it into the grass with slow, theatrical precision. A ruler. She was measuring my lawn with a ruler. Not a tape measure, not a yardstick for gardening, but an actual ruler like she was grading homework. And she did it with the focus of someone who believed she was protecting civilization. That single image burned into my mind because it explained everything. The exact inch measurements, the repeated notices, the obsession with edges, the determination to find something wrong even if it wasn't there. In a different context, it might have been absurd, but in that moment it felt invasive, like she had brought a microscope to my home and decided she had the right to inspect it. I didn't confront her, not because I couldn't, but because I had learned the hard way that direct conflict was the oxygen people like this needed, the thing that turned a minor annoyance into a full-time war, and the HOA system rewarded the loudest complainer by treating them like a volunteer deputy. So I did what I always did in situations where the rules were being used as weapons. I stepped back and observed. Her name showed up in the neighborhood group emails constantly, always concerned, always just asking, always speaking as if she represented a silent majority, and the more I watched, the more I realized she wasn't just a neighbor with opinions. She was connected to the HOA's enforcement pipeline. Her complaints became citations. Her measurements became official. Her personal grudge became policy, and that's a dangerous thing in a community that confuses uniformity with safety. The harassment escalated over the next few weeks in a way that felt calculated, like she was testing how much pressure she could apply before I cracked. One day it was grass height, then it was unapproved lawn edging, then it was improper watering schedule, then it was a note about visible soil patches, as if the earth itself was a violation. I began receiving notices so frequently that the envelopes started feeling like part of the mail's natural rhythm, and each one carried the same undertone. You are being watched, you are being judged, and we can make your life inconvenient whenever we want. I could tell she enjoyed it because she made a show of it, walking her dog slowly past my house, pausing near the sidewalk, bending down again with that ruler, sometimes taking photos, sometimes scribbling something onto her clipboard, her expression fixed in a smug concentration that made the whole scene feel like a performance staged for an audience I couldn't see. The neighborhood responded the way neighborhoods always do under petty tyranny. People avoided involvement. They didn't want to become targets. They didn't want drama. They smiled and waved and kept their heads down, and the HOA thrived in that silence. Meanwhile, I began documenting everything with the calm precision of someone who knows the truth is only useful if it can be proven later, photographing my lawn after every mowing, saving every notice, tracking the dates, the claimed measurements, the times her dog walk inspections occurred. I also started paying attention to something else, something most residents never think to examine because they assume it's settled: property lines. In this neighborhood, property boundaries were treated like concepts rather than realities, blurred by landscaping, decorative fences, and the assumption that whatever looked like someone's yard must belong to them. But I knew from experience that assumptions are where disputes breed, and I had a growing sense that Corinne's obsession with inches and borders wasn't confined to my lawn. It was part of her personality, her need to control space. That suspicion took on shape one afternoon when I noticed something odd near the corner where her front landscaping met the communal area, a strip of ground that always looked too manicured, too intentionally claimed. Her hedge line didn't follow the natural curve of the sidewalk the way other yards did. It pushed outward in a way that made her property look larger, more dominant, as if she had subtly expanded her domain over time. It wasn't dramatic, not something you'd notice unless you were looking for it, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and the irony hit like a cold wave. The woman measuring my grass with a ruler might have been sitting on inches, or feet, of land that wasn't hers. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even allow myself satisfaction yet. I simply pulled my home's original survey and plat map from the folder I had kept since moving in, and as I compared it to what existed outside, the mismatch began to appear, not just in her yard, but in the way the neighborhood had aged, how boundaries had softened into custom, and how certain homeowners had benefited from that softness by taking what wasn't clearly defended. I understood then why she was so aggressive about my grass, why she wanted me to look like the problem, why she needed the HOA to focus outward, because if anyone started paying attention to inches and lines, the first person to get exposed would be the one who had quietly crossed them. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm, because calm is what you feel when you finally see the game board clearly. The next step wasn't to fight her about lawn height. It wasn't to argue with the HOA. It was to do something quieter, something official, something that didn't rely on neighborhood gossip or HOA bias. I began making calls that sounded boring to anyone listening, the kind of calls that feel harmless until they aren't. Inquiries about boundary verification, easements, encroachments, and updated surveys, and each call felt like laying down a rail track toward a destination Corinne couldn't imagine. Because if she wanted to play with rulers and inches, I was about to bring in the only people whose measurements mattered, the kind of professionals who don't care about HOA politics or personal grudges, the kind of crew that shows up with equipment that turns assumptions into facts. And as the next HOA notice arrived in my mailbox, another warning about my lawn, another smug inch measurement, I held it in my hand and felt something shift, not fear, not stress, but the certainty that her little campaign was about to trigger the biggest mistake she had ever made, a mistake that would begin the moment a survey crew pulled up to her house and asked the one question she never expected anyone to ask: where exactly does your property end? The survey appointment didn't feel like a dramatic act when I scheduled it, because real reversals rarely begin with fireworks. They begin with paperwork and calm voices on the phone, with professionals asking practical questions and giving neutral timelines. And yet I felt the weight of it the moment the date was confirmed, not because I wanted conflict, but because I understood what a certified boundary verification meant in a neighborhood built on assumptions. The company I chose was local, experienced, and blunt in the way people become when they've watched property disputes eat friendships alive, and they treated my request like routine business, which was exactly what I needed, because routine is harder for an HOA to frame as retaliation. I asked for a full boundary survey with corner markers verified and encroachments noted. Nothing flashy, nothing emotional, just the truth measured with instruments that didn't care about neighborhood politics. As soon as the appointment was set, I felt a strange calm settle into my days, because while Corinne continued her ruler patrols, while the HOA continued its warnings, I had already moved the story into a different arena. one where authority was rooted in maps and law, not in the mood of a volunteer enforcer. The timing, however, was perfect in a way Karen couldn't have planned better if she had tried, because the moment the HOA sensed I wasn't rattled by the citations, they interpreted it as disrespect, and in a system built on control, perceived disrespect becomes fuel. The next notice arrived not as a gentle reminder but as an escalation, a formal intent to fine for repeated non-compliance, despite the fact that my lawn was trimmed, edged, and maintained like a professional crew had done it. They included photographs this time, grainy angles taken at awkward perspectives where shadows made grass look taller than it was, and they annotated those photos with arrows as if they were presenting evidence in court, and the absurdity of it might have been funny if it hadn't been so calculated. The language was careful, designed to corner me, stating that continued failure to maintain uniform community standards would result in penalties, and at the bottom was the signature line I expected, a name associated with the HOA's compliance committee, the kind of name that most residents never see but learn to fear. What I didn't expect was the subtle confirmation hidden inside the document, a reference to a complaint logged by a concerned resident, which told me Karen wasn't just observing, she was feeding the enforcement system directly, and the HOA was treating her ruler readings like gospel. I kept documenting everything, not because I planned to wave it around, but because documentation is a shield when narratives start to get rewritten. Meanwhile, Karen's performance intensified as if she had sensed something, not the survey itself, but the fact that her pressure wasn't working, and people like her hate nothing more than a target that stays calm. She began showing up earlier in the day, sometimes standing near the sidewalk when she thought I was inside, bending down with that ruler, making notes, lingering long enough for neighbors to notice, and then turning her head slightly as if she wanted them to witness her service. Her dog became a prop, an excuse to stop exactly where she wanted, to linger without appearing to linger, and the ruler remained her signature, a ridiculous tool that had become a symbol of her authority. The neighborhood group emails started to reflect it too, posts about maintaining curb appeal and following the rules for everyone's benefit. And each time I saw those messages, I could almost hear her voice behind them, framing herself as a guardian of standards while quietly testing how far she could push. Then the HOA tried a different tactic, something they use when they want to make a homeowner feel isolated. They sent a general community reminder about lawn compliance with an attached chart listing acceptable grass height and recommended mowing schedules, and it was written in that cheerful corporate tone that masks aggression. And I knew exactly why they sent it, to create the impression that the neighborhood was aligned against a problem, to make me feel like everyone else was watching too. But the effect wasn't what they wanted, because the moment they put grass height into a chart, they transformed it from opinion into measurement, and measurement invites comparison, and comparison invites questions. I started to notice other lawns that were taller than mine, corners that were uneven, strips along sidewalks that no one trimmed perfectly, and yet no one else seemed to be getting photographed with arrows and ruler readings, and that selective enforcement was the clearest sign of personal targeting. Still, I said nothing publicly. I didn't want to turn this into a debate. I wanted a single clean fact that couldn't be argued with. While I waited for the survey date, I took walks of my own, not to police neighbors, but to observe boundaries, the way fences sat, the way landscaping crept, the way hedges formed soft borders that might not match the legal lines. And the more I observed, the more I realized Karen's yard was not just aggressively maintained, it was aggressively claimed. Her front hedge line pushed outward into the shared buffer strip. Her decorative stone border curved in a way that claimed extra square footage, and near her side yard, a section of fencing looked slightly offset, not aligned with the natural property pattern of the street. It was subtle, but it was there, and in neighborhoods like this, subtle encroachments are common because most people don't challenge them, and once something has existed long enough, it begins to feel like it belongs. That's how people like Karen operate, not with bold theft, but with slow, confident expansion, inch by inch, until everyone else accepts the new shape as normal. The irony kept sharpening in my mind. She was measuring my grass down to fractions while quietly sitting on space that might not legally be hers at all. A few days before the survey, I received an email from the HOA inviting me to a compliance hearing, framed as an opportunity to address concerns and reach a resolution. And it had the same vibe as a polite threat. They wanted me in a room where they controlled the narrative, where Karen could sit with her ruler and her smug certainty, where board members could nod and treat my calm as defiance. It was a trap designed to force me into emotional reaction or hurried compromise, and they scheduled it before the survey date, which told me they wanted to close the issue before facts could arrive. I declined the hearing in writing with a neutral message acknowledging receipt and stating that I was addressing any measurable concerns through appropriate channels. That was all. No arguments, no accusations, nothing to latch onto. The response from the HOA was immediate, a shorter email that repeated deadlines and referenced potential fines, and again I saw the panic in their urgency, because when a homeowner refuses the theater, the HOA loses its favorite weapon. The day before the survey, Karen took her performance to a new level, and it was the moment I knew she had no concept of limits. I came home to find small orange marking flags placed near the edge of my lawn, like someone had staked out problem areas, and at first I thought it was a utility company. But the placement was too petty, too specific to the strip along the sidewalk and the corner near my mailbox. And the flags were cheap, the kind you can buy in bulk, not the kind utility crews use with printed labels. It felt like a warning, a message, a claim, and the fact that someone had stepped onto my property to plant them crossed a line that grass height never could. I removed them calmly and photographed where they had been, because again, the goal wasn't rage, it was record. That night I didn't sleep much, not from anxiety but from anticipation, because I knew the next day would change the power dynamic in a way Karen couldn't talk her way out of. Survey crews don't care about HOA politics. Their equipment doesn't care about Karen's confidence. Their stakes go where the legal lines go, and once those lines are marked, the neighborhood's imagined borders become irrelevant. The morning of the survey arrived with the kind of bright, indifferent sunlight that makes everything feel exposed. And when the truck finally pulled into my driveway, marked with the surveying company's logo and loaded with tripods and rods and cases that looked like they belonged on a construction site, I saw curtains shift in nearby houses, the neighborhood quietly waking up to the fact that something official was happening. The crew stepped out in reflective vests, calm and professional, carrying gear with the routine confidence of people who solve disputes by measuring reality, and they began their work without drama, setting up instruments, referencing maps, walking the edges of the property with steady focus. And as they moved along the line that ran near Karen's side yard, I saw her appear in the distance with her dog and her clipboard, like she couldn't resist inserting herself into any situation involving boundaries. Her pace slowed when she noticed the equipment. Her posture stiffened. For the first time since this started, she looked uncertain, not yet afraid, but alert in a way that suggested she recognized danger without understanding it. She lingered near her hedge, watching, waiting, and I watched back from my porch, calm as ever, because the clash she had been trying to provoke for weeks was finally arriving. But it wasn't going to be a shouting match about grass. It was going to be a quiet, irreversible exposure written in stakes and measurements. And as the crew prepared to place their first markers, the neighborhood held its breath without realizing it, because the next step would not just prove my lawn wasn't the problem. It would reveal whose property was actually out of line. The moment the first survey marker went into the ground, the entire situation shifted in a way no HOA notice ever could, because this was no longer about opinions, aesthetics, or selectively enforced rules. It was about fixed points on a map being translated into physical reality. And that kind of reality doesn't bend to confidence or intimidation. Crew worked with practiced efficiency, setting up their instruments, checking reference points, and moving methodically along the perimeter, their motions calm and deliberate, the opposite of the emotional energy Karen had been feeding on for weeks. I stayed on my porch, not hovering, not interfering, because I understood that distance mattered here. The less I inserted myself, the clearer it would become that this wasn't a personal dispute but a factual process unfolding exactly as it was supposed to. Karen, on the other hand, couldn't help herself. She lingered near the edge of her property, pretending to be absorbed in her phone while watching every movement of the surveyors out of the corner of her eye, her earlier confidence replaced by a tight alertness that suggested she was trying to calculate how much control she still had. At first, the markers went where everyone expected, along the obvious lines, reinforcing the assumption that nothing dramatic would happen, and I could almost feel her relaxing slightly, as if she believed this was just another bureaucratic nuisance she could outlast. But then the crew reached the section near her hedge, the area I had noticed weeks earlier, the strip of land that curved too generously into what looked like her yard, and the lead surveyor paused longer than usual, checking his readings, consulting the map, and adjusting the instrument with a level of attention that immediately drew Corinne's gaze. The marker didn't go where her landscaping suggested it should. It went several feet inward, cutting through the illusion of ownership she had cultivated with shrubs and stones. The surveyor placed the stake cleanly, decisively, and stepped back, and in that small motion, something fundamental cracked. Corinne's posture changed instantly, the casual observer replaced by someone struggling to reconcile expectation with outcome, and she moved closer under the pretense of curiosity, her ruler conspicuously absent now, because rulers are useless when the lines are no longer imaginary. The crew continued, marking additional points, each one reinforcing the same conclusion, that the visible boundaries she had treated as fact did not align with the legal ones, and with every stake, the space she believed she controlled shrank back toward the limits she had quietly exceeded. Neighbors began to appear, first one or two standing at a distance, then more, drawn by the unusual sight of official equipment and bright markers slicing through the familiar geometry of the street, and the energy shifted from private tension to public awareness. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The visual told the story better than words ever could, because nothing undermines assumed authority faster than evidence placed in the ground where everyone can see it. Corinne hovered near the edge of the activity, clearly wanting to intervene, to assert some version of control. But she hesitated, and that hesitation spoke volumes, because people who are certain they are right don't pause like that. As the crew verified corner points and adjusted lines, it became undeniable that her landscaping extended well beyond her property, not by an inch or two that could be dismissed as error, but by enough to matter, enough to transform her obsessive policing of my lawn into something grotesquely ironic. I watched her face cycle through emotions she had never allowed herself to show before, confusion giving way to irritation, irritation tightening into panic, and panic finally settling into a rigid mask of forced composure, as she realized she was no longer the one holding the measuring tool that mattered. The HOA notices she had weaponized for weeks suddenly felt irrelevant, flimsy pieces of paper compared to the stakes defining reality in real time. The crew finished their work with the same calm professionalism they had brought to it, documenting their findings, taking photographs and flagging encroachments without commentary, because they didn't need to editorialize. The facts were already loud. When they packed up, the markers remained, bright and unavoidable, cutting across Corinne's manicured illusion like a verdict that couldn't be appealed to a committee. The neighborhood didn't erupt into drama. It absorbed the moment quietly, people retreating to their homes with new information settling into their understanding of who had been right and who had been overreaching all along. Corinne retreated too, moving back toward her house with a stiffness that suggested she was already rehearsing explanations, rationalizations, anything that would preserve the image she had built of herself as the enforcer rather than the violator. That afternoon, the HOA emails stopped. No new warnings arrived, no reminders about grass height. The silence was immediate and conspicuous, and it confirmed what I already knew, that the association had been relying heavily on Corinne's complaints and now faced the uncomfortable task of reconciling her behavior with documented reality. The survey report arrived the next day, detailed and unambiguous, outlining boundary lines, encroachments, and the discrepancy between legal property limits and existing landscaping. And as I read it, I felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that comes from letting systems work the way they're supposed to when you don't interfere with them emotionally. I forwarded the report to the HOA with a brief, neutral note, not accusing, not demanding, simply providing information they could no longer ignore. And I imagined the moment it landed in their inbox, the collective intake of breath as they realized the narrative had flipped completely. Corinne had spent weeks measuring my lawn to fractions of an inch, but now the measurements that mattered showed her violations dwarfed anything she had accused me of, and the imbalance was impossible to explain away without exposing selective enforcement. The power dynamic she had relied on collapsed under the weight of impartial data, and the HOA, suddenly aware of its liability, was forced into a corner of its own making. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the street, the survey stakes glowed softly against the grass, visible reminders that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. And I knew the next phase of this story would not involve rulers or petty notices, but consequences, because when someone builds their authority on scrutiny, they rarely prepare for the moment that scrutiny turns back on them with precision they can't control. The HOA's reaction didn't arrive as an apology or an admission, because organizations built on control rarely pivot that way. It arrived instead as hesitation, delay, and carefully neutral silence that felt heavier than any threat they had sent before. And that silence told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking the survey results. For the first time since Karen had started her ruler campaign, there were no new notices in my mailbox, no emails reminding me of deadlines, no vague warnings about community standards. And the sudden absence of pressure was so stark it almost felt unreal, like the air after a storm where everything pauses to reassess what's still standing. Meanwhile, the survey markers remained in place, bright flags and stakes that didn't care about discomfort or embarrassment, turning what had once been an invisible issue into a daily, unavoidable visual reminder that the neighborhood's assumptions were wrong. Neighbors began stopping during walks, not to gossip openly, but to stare a little longer than usual at the markers cutting through Karen's carefully manicured edge. And each look carried quiet understanding, the kind that spreads without needing explanation. Karen herself reacted the only way she knew how at first, by pretending nothing had happened, continuing her routine with exaggerated normalcy, walking her dog past my house without the ruler this time, her posture stiff, her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the stakes that now defined the limits of her authority. But denial is exhausting when evidence is planted in the ground, and as days passed, cracks appeared in her performance. The dog walks became shorter, her presence less theatrical, and the energy she once radiated as certainty now felt brittle, like confidence stretched too thin. Behind the scenes, the HOA was scrambling, not publicly, but administratively, because survey reports don't just challenge neighbors, they challenge liability, and liability makes boards nervous in a way no homeowner ever could. I knew this because the tone of their internal communications shifted when they finally reached out, not to enforce, but to clarify, a carefully chosen word that signaled they were no longer comfortable asserting anything without verification. They requested a copy of the full survey report, even though they had already received it, a move that suggested multiple people were now reviewing the same facts and realizing the problem wasn't my lawn, it was their process. The moment an HOA realizes it may have enforced rules selectively, the entire system wobbles because selective enforcement doesn't just undermine authority, it exposes it. Karen's complaints were now a paper trail, and that trail led directly to a documented encroachment on her own property, one that was significant enough to require correction, not just quietly, but officially. The HOA tried to regain footing by reframing the issue as a boundary clarification matter, separate from lawn compliance, as if they could isolate the two narratives and deal with them independently. But the neighborhood wasn't buying that separation, because everyone could see the cause and effect laid out in plain sight. Karen had escalated lawn complaints to absurd levels, and in doing so, she had triggered scrutiny that revealed her own violations were far more serious, and no amount of administrative language could untangle that irony. She attempted to regain control through social channels next, subtly at first, posting general comments about survey errors and interpretation differences in neighborhood groups without naming specifics, hoping to seed doubt before the HOA made anything official. But the strategy backfired because the survey markers were still there, unmoving, impartial, and more convincing than speculation. A few neighbors who had previously stayed quiet began asking questions, not accusatory but curious, and curiosity is dangerous to people who rely on unquestioned authority. Karen responded with defensiveness masked as indignation, framing herself as a victim of overreach, of technicalities being weaponized against her. And in doing so, she revealed the same mindset she had applied to my lawn, that rules were tools to be used selectively, acceptable when they favored her, unfair when they didn't. The HOA, caught between appeasing a vocal enforcer and protecting itself from exposure, delayed action, scheduling internal reviews, consulting their legal language, and advising patients, and that delay allowed the situation to ferment rather than resolve. During that time, the neighborhood atmosphere changed subtly but permanently, people walking with more awareness, noticing property lines, questioning long-held assumptions, and realizing how easily small abuses of power could hide behind familiarity. I continued my routine unchanged, mowing when needed, documenting as always, but no longer feeling watched in the same way, because the watcher had become the watched, and that reversal drained the tension that had fueled Karen's campaign. When the HOA finally sent out a general notice acknowledging a boundary survey had identified discrepancies requiring review, the wording was cautious, almost apologetic, and notably absent was any mention of lawn compliance, a quiet concession that the original issue had lost credibility. Karen's name was not mentioned, but the implication was unmistakable, and the effect was immediate, neighbors connecting the dots and reassessing weeks of enforcement drama through a new lens. Karen's behavior shifted again, this time toward urgency, and she began making visible changes to her yard, trimming hedges aggressively, moving decorative stones, attempting to erase the evidence before formal action could be taken. But the markers made that impossible, because moving plants doesn't move legal lines, and every hurried adjustment only emphasized how far past them she had gone. The HOA, now aware of its exposure, requested she cease any modifications until compliance steps could be formally determined, a directive that stripped her of the autonomy she had wielded so freely against others, and that loss of control hit her harder than any fine would have. The neighborhood watched quietly as the dynamic continued to invert, the former enforcer now constrained by process, the former target now irrelevant to enforcement, and the lessons settled in collectively that rules applied without humility eventually apply in unexpected directions. By the end of the week, Karen's ruler had disappeared entirely, not just from her walks, but from memory, replaced by the much larger instruments of measurement she could not manipulate. And as the HOA prepared to issue formal notices regarding encroachment remediation, it became clear that the story had moved beyond lawn height into something far more consequential. Because once authority is exposed as selective, it cannot simply reset and continue as before. The next chapter would not be about whether Karen was wrong, that had already been established in the quiet certainty of survey lines. It would be about consequences, about how someone who built identity on enforcement responds when enforcement turns inward, and whether the HOA would choose accountability or retreat, a decision that would determine not just Karen's fate, but the future balance of power in the neighborhood itself. The formal encroachment notice arrived with none of the dramatic flair Karen had favored when it was my lawn under scrutiny, because when authority turns inward, it prefers quiet precision over spectacle, and that difference alone marked how completely the balance of power had shifted. The HOA's language was clinical, referencing survey findings, boundary discrepancies, and required corrective action within a defined timeframe. And while the notice avoided assigning blame publicly, it left no room for interpretation privately, because the measurements were now fixed, verified, and legally binding. Karen's reaction unfolded in stages that mirrored the way she had treated me, beginning with disbelief, then indignation, and finally a frantic attempt to reframe the narrative before it hardened into consequence. She circulated messages insisting the survey must be flawed, that property lines were commonly understood in the neighborhood, that landscaping had existed that way for years, as if time itself could override recorded boundaries, and those arguments might have worked once, when no one had reason to look closely. But now they felt hollow against the bright certainty of the markers still visible to anyone who passed. The HOA responded not with debate but with process, requesting documentation, historical approvals, anything that could support her claims, and that request exposed the same vulnerability she had exploited in others, because assumptions are easy to live with until someone asks you to prove them. Karen attempted to rally sympathy by framing the notice as harassment, positioning herself as a victim of technicalities and overreach. But the effort faltered because residents had watched her measure my lawn with a ruler, had seen the repeated notices she triggered, and could not reconcile that memory with her sudden aversion to measurement. The irony was impossible to ignore, and silence replaced support, neighbors unwilling to defend behavior they now recognized as excessive. As the compliance deadline approached, Karen's yard became a site of visible anxiety, her once pristine landscaping disrupted by tentative adjustments, hedges trimmed back unevenly, stones removed and stacked at awkward angles, the illusion of effortless control replaced by the stress of remediation she had never anticipated facing. Each change drew more attention rather than less, reinforcing the reality that her property, once a symbol of authority, was now a problem requiring correction. The HOA maintained its distance, issuing reminders rather than threats, and that restraint underscored how differently the system behaved when it was protecting itself rather than enforcing aesthetics, because escalation now carried risk. I watched these developments from the periphery, not involved in decisions, not consulted for opinions, and that absence was itself a form of resolution, because the conflict no longer centered on me at all. It had turned fully toward the consequences of Karen's own actions. The survey crew returned briefly to verify markers after her initial adjustments, confirming that the encroachment remained unresolved, and that verification removed any lingering doubt that this was a misunderstanding rather than a violation. Karen's attempts to negotiate informally intensified, reaching out to neighbors, referencing shared history, appealing to familiarity as if it were a substitute for legality. But those conversations lacked traction because the neighborhood's perspective had changed. Familiarity was no longer comforting, it was suspicious, a reminder of how easily norms could be bent when no one checked. The HOA scheduled a compliance review meeting, not public, not theatrical, but procedural. And while Karen attended, her influence within that space was markedly diminished, her role shifting from vocal enforcer to subject under review, and that inversion was perhaps the most destabilizing consequence of all. The board's questions mirrored the ones she had once asked others, requesting measurements, timelines, justifications, and with each question, the absence of answers became more pronounced. The outcome of the review was predictable but still sobering, a requirement to restore the property to its legal boundaries within a set period or face escalating penalties, and that determination stripped away any remaining illusion that persistence or volume could override documented reality. Karen left the meeting without the performative confidence she once displayed, her presence in the neighborhood shrinking in the days that followed, fewer walks, fewer emails, fewer attempts to assert relevance, and that retreat spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. The HOA, having navigated this reversal cautiously, began reassessing its enforcement processes more broadly, recognizing that reliance on a single resident's complaints had exposed them to liability and reputational damage, and that realization prompted internal reviews that would quietly reshape how future issues were handled. Notices became less frequent, documentation requirements more stringent, and the culture of instant citation gave way to verification, a change driven not by idealism but by self-preservation. Neighbors noticed the shift immediately, sensing a lighter atmosphere, fewer tensions, a gradual return to normalcy that felt earned rather than imposed, and conversations that had once been whispered now surfaced openly, reflections on how close the neighborhood had come to institutionalizing pettiness as governance. Karen's yard, meanwhile, transformed slowly but visibly, encroaching elements removed, boundaries restored, the once dominant landscape pulled back into alignment, and with each adjustment, the symbolism deepened because the very inches she had obsessed over in my lawn were now the inches she was forced to surrender. The ruler never reappeared, not because it was forbidden, but because its meaning had changed, transformed from a tool of control into a reminder of how control can rebound when misused. The HOA eventually closed the matter with a final compliance confirmation, a brief notice stating the encroachment had been addressed satisfactorily, and that closure felt definitive not because it was dramatic, but because it resolved the imbalance that had fueled the conflict in the first place. As life settled back into routine, the neighborhood carried forward an unspoken lesson. That enforcement without humility invites scrutiny, that power exercised carelessly creates its own undoing, and that sometimes the most effective response to harassment is not confrontation, but patience paired with precision. The story that began with a ruler pressed into grass had evolved into a quiet reckoning written in survey stakes and compliance notices. And as the dust settled, it became clear that Karen's greatest miscalculation was believing that attention could only flow outward, never inward, a belief that cost her far more than any lawn citation ever could, and set the stage for a final chapter defined not by conflict, but by reflection on how easily authority can become its own liability when left unchecked. The aftermath of Karen's compliance did not restore the neighborhood to its old rhythm so much as it exposed how artificial that rhythm had always been. Because once the loudest enforcer lost her footing, the silence that followed felt revealing rather than peaceful. For the first time since I had moved in, mornings arrived without the sense of being evaluated. Afternoons passed without the expectation of notices, and evenings settled without the low-level tension that comes from knowing someone is always looking for something to criticize. and that absence made it clear how much energy the community had been spending simply managing fear. The HOA, perhaps chastened by how close it had come to institutional embarrassment, recalibrated quietly, not with announcements or reforms, but with restraint, fewer citations issued, more verification required, a noticeable pause where instant enforcement had once lived, and that pause gave residents room to breathe and observe. People began talking again in ways that felt less guarded, conversations lingering on sidewalks, casual acknowledgments of how strange the past weeks had been, and subtle nods toward a shared understanding that something had shifted beneath the surface. Corinne's presence diminished further, her once ritualized walks replaced by shorter, less predictable outings, her posture no longer rigid with purpose but cautious, as if she were relearning how to occupy space without claiming it. The neighborhood group messages changed too, the tone softening, fewer lectures about standards, more practical questions about schedules and maintenance, and the absence of her authoritative voice was conspicuous, not because it was missed, but because its removal exposed how much of the discourse had been shaped by one person's fixation. I found myself reflecting on how easily that fixation had been enabled, how the HOA's structure had rewarded vigilance over fairness, and how that reward system had allowed Corinne's ruler to become an instrument of power rather than absurdity. The realization carried a weight that went beyond personal vindication, because it suggested that the issue was never just Corinne. It was a system that mistook enthusiasm for legitimacy and volume for accuracy. In the weeks that followed, small tests of the new equilibrium emerged organically, not as rebellions, but as quiet assertions of normalcy, a lawn left a fraction longer after rain, a hedge trimmed on a different schedule, a minor repair completed without immediate notification, and when no citation followed, the community began to internalize a new baseline, one less rigid, less punitive, more human. The HOA responded to these shifts with caution, aware now that aggressive enforcement carried reputational risk, and that awareness altered behavior more effectively than any rulebook revision ever could. I noticed a change in myself as well, the constant documentation habit loosening, the urge to photograph every mo fading, replaced by trust that I would not need to prove my compliance preemptively, and that change felt like reclaiming a piece of mental space I hadn't realized I had surrendered. Corinne's story, meanwhile, continued quietly, not as a redemption arc or a dramatic downfall, but as a slow recalibration of identity, because when someone builds their sense of purpose around enforcement, losing that role leaves a vacuum that is difficult to fill. Her interactions grew tentative, polite in a way that felt rehearsed, as if she were unsure which version of herself was now acceptable, and the neighborhood responded with a cautious neutrality that neither punished nor embraced her, simply allowing time to do what confrontation never could. The HOA's internal processes continued to evolve incrementally, committees asking for more documentation, compliance reviews taking longer, the system rediscovering the value of due diligence through necessity rather than philosophy, and that evolution hinted at a lesson learned the hard way, that authority exercised without proportional accountability eventually turns inward. Neighbors who had once avoided involvement began attending meetings out of curiosity rather than obligation, their questions measured, their tone collaborative, and that participation subtly shifted the dynamic, reminding the board that governance functions best when it reflects the community rather than policing it. I watched these developments with a sense of quiet completion, aware that my role in the story had effectively ended once the survey stakes went into the ground, and that everything that followed was the natural consequence of truth applied without theatrics. The ruler that had once symbolized Corinne's power now felt almost mythical, a relic of a mindset the neighborhood had outgrown, and its absence served as a daily reminder that control based on obsession is inherently unstable. As summer progressed, the lawns across the neighborhood grew in varied rhythms, some trimmed short, others allowed to breathe, and the visual diversity felt less like disorder and more like authenticity, a reflection of individual lives rather than enforced uniformity. The HOA's notices, when they did appear, were clearer, rarer, and supported by verification, and that restraint built credibility in a way relentless enforcement never had. Corinne's yard, now firmly within its legal boundaries, blended back into the landscape, no longer asserting dominance through expansion, and that visual humility mirrored the broader cultural shift taking place. The story that had begun with inches measured in grass had matured into something less tangible but more enduring, a recalibration of how power is exercised and challenged in shared spaces. And as the season turned, the neighborhood carried forward an unspoken, understanding that vigilance without self-awareness is a liability, not a virtue. There was no celebration, no apology, no formal closure, just a gradual return to normal life informed by a memory that would surface whenever someone felt tempted to reach for a ruler rather than perspective. And that memory, quiet and persistent, ensured that the lesson would last longer than any notice ever could. What surprised me most as weeks turned into months was not how thoroughly Karen's authority dissolved, but how quickly the neighborhood began to recalibrate itself once the pressure lifted, as if a muscle long held in tension had finally been allowed to relax, revealing how unnecessary that tension had always been. The HOA's recalibration continued quietly, almost invisibly, not through sweeping reforms announced with optimism, but through a series of small, deliberate pauses where automatic enforcement used to live. And those pauses changed everything because they forced the board to consider context before consequence. Notices that once arrived with rigid certainty were now preceded by verification, requests for clarification, and occasionally nothing at all. And the absence of immediate reaction encouraged residents to handle minor issues among themselves, conversations replacing citations, cooperation replacing surveillance. This shift created a new kind of visibility, not the invasive kind Karen had thrived on, but a communal awareness rooted in shared responsibility. And it became clear that most people had never wanted to weaponize rules. They had simply complied because resistance felt risky. Karen's place in this new environment was complicated, not ostracized, not forgiven, but quietly redefined. Her presence no longer commanding attention, her opinions no longer amplified by an enforcement pipeline eager to act on them. She attended fewer gatherings, spoke less in group messages, and when she did contribute, her tone was noticeably restrained, careful in a way that suggested she was measuring her words the way she once measured grass, aware now that scrutiny could flow both ways. The neighborhood responded with a cautious neutrality that allowed space for adjustment without erasing memory, a collective understanding that accountability does not require cruelty, only consistency. As autumn approached, the physical landscape mirrored the social one, lawns transitioning at different paces, leaves gathering naturally before being cleared, hedges trimmed when needed rather than on a schedule dictated by fear, and the diversity felt less like non-compliance and more like life unfolding as it should. The HOA's meetings reflected this evolution, agendas shorter, discussions more focused on maintenance and safety than aesthetics, and participation driven by interest rather than obligation. And while not everyone agreed on every issue, the disagreements felt constructive rather than punitive. I noticed how often survey language surfaced casually now, not as a threat, but as a reference point, an acknowledgement that clear boundaries protect everyone when respected universally, and that respect had to be mutual to mean anything. Karen's earlier encroachment became a quiet case study, not spoken of directly, but present in the way people talked about space and ownership. A reminder that confidence without verification is fragile, and that the most damaging overreach often hides in plain sight until someone insists on precision. The HOA's internal culture continued to shift as well, committee roles rotating, responsibilities shared, and decisions documented more thoroughly. A procedural humility born from experience rather than ideology, and that humility reduced the temptation to elevate individual complaints into policy. Neighbors who had once avoided attention began contributing in small ways, volunteering for maintenance days, coordinating seasonal tasks, and building relationships that made enforcement feel redundant. And the sense of shared stewardship replaced the adversarial dynamic that had once defined the neighborhood. I felt a subtle gratitude for having chosen patience over confrontation, not because it spared me stress, but because it allowed the system to correct itself without creating new fractures, and that outcome felt more satisfying than any dramatic vindication ever could have. Karen's adaptation continued unevenly, moments of restraint punctuated by flashes of old habits, quickly checked by awareness, and those moments served as reminders that change is rarely linear, especially for someone whose identity had been intertwined with control. The neighborhood met those moments without escalation, neither rewarding nor punishing them, simply allowing the new norms to hold, And over time, even Karen seemed to accept that the ground beneath her had shifted in ways she could not reverse. The HOA's communications grew clearer, less performative, more factual, and that clarity fostered trust incrementally, residents no longer bracing for hidden threats in cheerful language, but reading notices as information rather than warnings. As winter approached, the stakes from the survey were removed, their job complete, but the memory of where they had stood remained vivid, a mental map overlaying the physical one, reminding everyone that boundaries exist whether acknowledged or not, and that ignoring them carries consequences. The absence of visible markers did not erase the lesson. It embedded it, transforming how residents perceived their space and their relationship to governance. I found myself thinking less about the conflict itself and more about what it had revealed. That power exercised without accountability tends to overreach, and that systems designed to manage communities can easily drift toward control if not grounded in fairness. The neighborhood's resilience in the face of that drift became a quiet source of pride, not because it triumphed over an individual, but because it recalibrated toward balance, and that balance felt sustainable. Karen's yard, now indistinguishable from others in scale and alignment, no longer drew attention, and that invisibility marked the end of her chapter as an enforcer, though not necessarily as a neighbor, and that distinction mattered because it allowed the community to move forward without rewriting its past. As the year drew closer to its end, the story that began with a ruler pressed into grass had evolved into a broader understanding of how small obsessions can distort systems when left unchecked, and how quietly insisting on accuracy can restore equilibrium without spectacle. The next phase would not involve surveys or notices, but reflection, the long-term settling of a community that had glimpsed the cost of unchecked authority and chosen, almost unconsciously, to step away from it, setting the stage for a final chapter not defined by conflict, but by the enduring impact of a lesson learned the hard way and carried forward in everyday choices. The deeper impact of what had happened only became visible with time, because once the immediate tension faded, the neighborhood began to notice how much of its behavior had been shaped by fear rather than agreement. And that realization quietly rewrote the way people interacted with both the HOA and each other. Without Karen's constant surveillance and the HOA's reflexive enforcement, residents started making decisions based on practicality instead of compliance anxiety, watering lawns according to weather rather than schedules, trimming hedges when growth demanded it rather than when reminders arrived. And these small acts of autonomy accumulated into a broader sense of normalcy that felt almost rebellious simply because it had been absent for so long. The HOA, still cautious from recent exposure, continued to operate with restraint, issuing fewer notices and taking longer to act. And that delay, once interpreted as weakness, now felt like consideration, a recognition that not every deviation required correction. Meetings became spaces for discussion rather than discipline, and while disagreements still occurred, they unfolded without the looming threat of punitive action, allowing solutions to emerge organically rather than being imposed. Karen's presence during this period was subdued, her earlier certainty replaced by a careful attentiveness that suggested she was relearning how to exist within a community that no longer rewarded vigilance as virtue. She attended meetings occasionally, sitting quietly, listening more than speaking, and when she did contribute, her words were measured, stripped of the authority she once assumed, and that transformation, though incomplete, marked a significant departure from the role she had played before. The neighborhood responded not with hostility, but with a reserved acceptance, neither forgiving nor condemning her past actions, simply allowing the present to redefine her place, and that neutrality created space for genuine change rather than performative contrition. The HOA's internal culture continued to shift as well, committees rotating membership more frequently, decisions documented with greater care, and enforcement protocols revised to require verification from multiple sources rather than reliance on a single complaint. A change born not of altruism, but of necessity, yet one that carried meaningful consequences for fairness. Residents began volunteering for small roles, coordinating seasonal maintenance, organizing informal gatherings, and these acts of participation reduced reliance on top-down control, fostering a sense of shared ownership that no rulebook could mandate. I found myself reflecting on how easily the conflict could have escalated had I chosen confrontation over process, and how patience paired with accuracy had allowed the truth to assert itself without collateral damage. a lesson that resonated beyond the immediate outcome. The memory of the survey stakes remained vivid, not as symbols of victory, but as reminders that boundaries exist independently of belief, and that respecting them requires humility rather than dominance. As winter settled in, the physical landscape changed. Lawns dormant, growth paused, and with it came a psychological pause, an opportunity for the neighborhood to internalize what it had learned without the distraction of active disputes. The HOA's communications during this period were sparse and factual, focused on maintenance and safety rather than aesthetics, and that shift reinforced the sense that governance had recalibrated toward function rather than appearance. Karen's adaptation continued quietly, moments of old habits surfacing occasionally only to recede again, checked by awareness and the memory of consequences, and over time those moments became less frequent, suggesting that even deeply ingrained patterns can soften when reinforcement is removed. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact during enforcement episodes now lingered in conversation, sharing experiences, acknowledging how close the community had come to institutionalizing pettiness, and those shared reflections strengthened bonds that had been weakened by years of quiet compliance. I noticed how often people referenced before and after when discussing neighborhood issues, using the lawn dispute as a temporal marker, a shorthand for a period when fear shaped behavior and its gradual dissolution afterward. And that collective framing ensured the lesson would persist beyond individual memory. The HOA's board, now operating under heightened awareness of its role, began discussing long-term governance principles, transparency, proportionality, and community engagement, concepts that had once seemed abstract but now felt essential. And while progress was uneven, the conversation itself marked a departure from enforcement-driven identity. The absence of dramatic resolution allowed these changes to embed themselves more deeply, because without spectacle, there was no single moment to forget, only a sustained shift that became normal through repetition. As spring approached, new growth appeared across the neighborhood, lawns greening at different rates, flowers emerging unpredictably, and the visual diversity felt emblematic of the broader transformation, individuality coexisting within shared space without constant correction. Karen's yard, now indistinguishable in scale and alignment, blended into this landscape, no longer asserting dominance through expansion, and that visual humility mirrored the social one taking shape. The story that had begun with a ruler pressed into grass had matured into a quiet redefinition of community dynamics, one where authority was tempered by accountability and vigilance gave way to trust. And as the chapter drew to a close, it became clear that the most enduring outcome was not the exposure of a single violation, but the restoration of balance in a system that had drifted too far toward control, setting the stage for a final chapter focused not on conflict, but on what it means to live in a shared space where rules serve people rather than dominate them. By the time the neighborhood reached what felt like stability, it became clear that the real conflict had never been about grass height or property lines, but about how easily authority can grow distorted when no one expects it to be questioned. And that realization settled slowly, reshaping attitudes in ways that were subtle yet permanent. The HOA, operating under the weight of recent lessons, moved with a new deliberateness that contrasted sharply with its former urgency. Decisions taking longer, documentation reviewed more carefully, and enforcement approached with hesitation rather than certainty. And while some residents initially mistook this caution for weakness, it soon revealed itself as something more valuable, a recognition that power exercised without reflection invites its own undoing. Conversations at meetings shifted from complaints to considerations, discussions framed around impact rather than infraction, and the tone of governance softened in a way that allowed nuance to exist where rigidity once ruled. Karen's presence during this period remained understated, her earlier identity as a self-appointed enforcer replaced by a quieter, more ambiguous role, and that ambiguity seemed to trouble her at first, as if she were navigating a space without a script. But over time, it appeared to free her from the constant vigilance that had defined her interactions. She no longer walked the neighborhood with purpose sharpened by scrutiny, but with a neutrality that suggested she was still adjusting to the idea that not every deviation required her attention, and that adjustment, while incomplete, marked genuine change. The community responded by normalizing this new dynamic, neither rewarding nor punishing her restraint, simply allowing it to exist, and in doing so, it modeled a different kind of accountability, one rooted in consistency rather than confrontation. I observed these shifts with a sense of distance, aware that my involvement had long since ceased to be central, and that the most meaningful outcomes were unfolding independently of any single participant. The survey that had sparked the reversal faded into memory, its stakes removed, its lines internalized, yet its impact lingered in the way people referenced boundaries, both physical and social, with greater care, and that internalization was perhaps the most significant change of all. The HOA's revised protocols began to take shape more clearly, requirements for corroboration established, timelines clarified, and the reliance on individual complaints diminished in favor of observable standards. And while these changes did not eliminate conflict entirely, they reframed it in a way that prioritized fairness over expediency. Residents noticed the difference immediately, the reduction in arbitrary notices easing a long-standing anxiety, and that relief translated into increased participation, people more willing to engage when engagement no longer felt like exposure. Seasonal transitions continued to mark the passage of time, and with each change, the neighborhood tested its new equilibrium, minor issues arising and resolving without escalation, reinforcing the idea that not every problem requires institutional intervention. Koren's adaptation followed a similar pattern, moments of old habits surfacing briefly before receding, checked by awareness and the memory of consequence, and over time those moments became rarer, suggesting that identity shaped by reinforcement can be reshaped when reinforcement disappears. The HOA's board, still cautious, began reflecting openly on the broader implications of what had happened, acknowledging that enforcement culture had drifted toward performative control rather than service, and that correction required not just procedural updates, but a shift in mindset. These reflections did not come with apologies or grand statements, but with incremental changes that spoke louder than rhetoric, and that restraint lent them credibility. Neighbors who had once avoided involvement found themselves contributing ideas, volunteering time, and engaging in ways that strengthened community ties, and this increased cohesion reduced the need for oversight organically, demonstrating that trust, once restored, can regulate behavior more effectively than fear. I found myself thinking less about the initial harassment and more about the lesson it had exposed. That precision applied calmly can dismantle overreach without escalating conflict, and that patience paired with process often achieves what confrontation cannot. The neighborhood's shared memory of the ruler incident became a quiet reference point, not invoked to shame, but to remind, a cautionary tale about how small obsessions can distort systems when left unchecked. As months passed, the HOA's identity continued to evolve, less defined by enforcement metrics and more by facilitation. And while this transformation was neither complete nor guaranteed, it marked a departure from the culture that had enabled Koren's campaign in the first place. The absence of drama allowed these changes to root themselves deeply, because without spectacle, there was no backlash to fade, only new habits forming through repetition. Koren's yard, long since restored to its legal boundaries, blended into the seasonal shifts like any other, and that visual ordinariness symbolized the end of her role as a focal point, the conflict having moved on from individuals to principles. As the year drew toward its close, the neighborhood carried forward a collective awareness that governance functions best when it remains humble, that rules gain legitimacy through consistency rather than severity, and that accountability, once experienced, reshapes expectations permanently. The story that began with a ruler pressed into grass had become a shared understanding about balance, power, and restraint. And as this chapter drew to a close, it was evident that the final resolution would not hinge on further action or revelation, but on whether the lessons learned would endure beyond memory, shaping choices quietly long after the conflict itself had faded, setting the stage for a concluding chapter focused not on what was exposed, but on what was preserved through change. The true ending of the story did not announce itself with closure or ceremony, but with a gradual normalization that felt earned rather than imposed, because what had changed was not a rule or a policy, but the collective posture of the neighborhood toward authority, accountability, and one another. The HOA, once defined by vigilance and speed, settled into a rhythm shaped by deliberation, its actions slower but steadier, its communications clearer and less performative. And while this new approach lacked the sharp edges of past enforcement, it carried a legitimacy that had been absent for years. Residents adjusted to this shift almost instinctively, responding not with resistance but with participation, recognizing that governance no longer functioned as a looming threat, but as a shared framework that required engagement to remain fair. The absence of constant scrutiny allowed daily life to breathe. Lawns tended according to seasons rather than schedules, small imperfections accepted as part of lived space rather than violations, and this acceptance fostered a sense of ownership that fear never could. Corinne's transformation, though never dramatic, became complete in its subtlety, her presence blending back into the community without the aura of enforcement that once surrounded her, her interactions marked by restraint and an awareness shaped by experience rather than certainty. She was no longer a figure of tension or judgment, simply another neighbor navigating the same shared environment, and that ordinariness marked the most definitive resolution of all, because it signaled the end of a dynamic that had thrived on imbalance. The neighborhood, having witnessed the consequences of unchecked authority, carried forward a quiet vigilance of its own, not toward each other, but toward the systems meant to serve them, questions asked earlier, assumptions examined, and boundaries respected not because they were feared, but because they were understood. The survey that had once defined the conflict faded into history, its stakes long removed, yet its impact remained embedded in collective memory, a reminder that clarity dispels conflict more effectively than confrontation. The HOA's evolving identity reflected this lesson, committees operating with transparency, enforcement actions grounded in verification, and an unspoken understanding that credibility, once lost, must be rebuilt through consistency rather than assertion. Seasonal changes continued to mark time, lawns greening, leaves falling, growth pausing and resuming. And through these cycles, the neighborhood's new equilibrium held, tested quietly by minor issues that resolved without escalation, reinforcing the durability of the transformation. I found myself reflecting on how easily the story could have ended differently, how confrontation might have escalated, how anger could have hardened positions, and how much collateral damage that path would have caused. And that reflection underscored the value of patience paired with precision, a combination that had allowed truth to surface without spectacle. The ruler that had once symbolized control became a shared anecdote, a shorthand for overreach, and its memory served not to shame but to remind, a cultural reference point that discouraged repetition of the same mistake. The HOA's meetings, now quieter and more purposeful, reflected a community no longer driven by fear of fines but by interest in outcomes, and that shift transformed participation from obligation into choice. Corinne's yard, indistinguishable from others, no longer asserted dominance through expansion, and that visual harmony mirrored the social one, a balance restored not by force but by correction. As time passed, new residents moved in, unaware of the specifics of what had happened, yet they inherited a community shaped by its lessons, governance structures tempered by experience, and neighbors attuned to the importance of accountability, and this inheritance ensured the impact would outlast memory. The story's resolution lay not in vindication but in recalibration, a system corrected not through rebellion but through adherence to its own principles, and that correction proved more enduring than any dramatic victory ever could have. The neighborhood emerged not perfect, but resilient, capable of absorbing conflict without fracturing, and that resilience became its defining feature. As the chapter closed, it was clear that the ruler incident had done more than expose a single violation. It had redefined how power was perceived and exercised within the community, reminding everyone that rules gain meaning only when applied with humility, that authority must withstand scrutiny to deserve trust, and that shared spaces thrive when governance serves people rather than controlling them. A lesson quietly carried forward in everyday choices long after the last measurement was taken, and the grass grew freely once again.